never thought betrayal could taste like champagne. That night, the bubbles slid down my throat with a bitter twist, pooling uneasily in my stomach. The grand ballroom glittered under a canopy of crystal chandeliers, their light cascading like liquid gold across the marble floors. I wore a silk dress the color of twilight, and Marcus, my husband of 15 years, was by my side, charming our colleagues with his effortless charisma. We looked perfect. I believed we were perfect. It wasn't until I excused myself to the powder room that the first crack appeared. The room was gilded, mirrors reflecting endless versions of myself, each more uncertain than the last. I was reapplying my lipstick when 2 women in sleek designer gowns walked in, giggling. I tried not to listen. Politeness was a reflex. But then I heard his name. Marcus? Oh, honey, he's practically living at the office now. Claire's got him wrapped around her finger. The other woman snorted, adjusting her diamond earring. Office, my ass. They've been sneaking around for months. Remember that business trip to Chicago? Not so businessy. My hand froze mid-application. The lipstick snapped, a jagged red line staining the sink. They didn't notice me. They continued, oblivious to the storm building behind my eyes. They whispered about late-night dinners, Claire leaving his car in the lot until morning, their stolen kisses in the stairwell. I felt my pulse in my throat, each beat screaming a word I didn't want to hear. Affair. 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 The room felt too small, the air thick with perfume and lies. I couldn't breathe. I slipped out, clutching my tiny silver clutch like a lifeline. Back in the ballroom, Marcus was laughing at something his boss said, his hand resting casually on his glass. I wanted to scream, to break the fragile surface of our perfect life, but I couldn't. Not there, not with dozens of eyes, watching. I made my way to the bar, downed another glass of champagne, and smiled when someone complimented my dress. My cheeks ached from forcing normalcy, but inside, I was falling, plummeting down a chasm I hadn't known existed. Later that night at home, I waited until Marcus fell asleep, his arm thrown casually over his side of the bed. I slipped out of the sheets, tiptoed to his office, and opened his laptop. My hands shook as I searched his calendar. There it was, the trip to Chicago, listed as client engagement, late-night meetings, dinners marked private. Emails popped up, and I couldn't help myself. I opened one, then another. They weren't incriminating on the surface, but the tone was wrong. Personal, familiar. A photo of a sunset from his hotel room window, captioned, "Wish you were here." Sent to Claire. I clicked on his message history, and there it was, a text from her, late at night, thanking him for an unforgettable evening. I felt like I was drowning. My wedding ring, silver and simple, engraved with forever, felt heavy, as if the promise had twisted itself into something poisonous. I backed away from the desk, my hands cold despite the heat crawling up my spine. The betrayal was real. It was there, glaring at me from the screen, like a wound bleeding words I couldn't take back. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't breathe the same air as him. I locked myself in the guest room, sliding down the door, tears blurring my vision. My world had splintered in one night, and I didn't know how to put it back together. The last thing I remember before sleep claimed me was the sound of the wind rattling the window pane. Like the world itself was mourning my shattered life. Used to believe that love, true love, was a fortress, unbreakable, unyielding. But looking back now, I realize it was always made of glass, fragile and easily shattered. We met on a spring evening, the kind where the air is heavy with the scent of jasmine and possibility. Marcus was magnetic. He walked into the room like he owned the world, confidence rolling off him in waves. His smile was disarming, his laugh infectious. I was smitten before the first glass of wine was empty. Our romance was a whirlwind. Late-night drives with the windows down, his hand resting on my thigh, promises whispered in darkened rooms, stolen kisses beneath city lights. I remember our wedding day like it was yesterday, how the sky opened up and poured just as I stepped out in my gown, rain tapping on my veil like a whisper. He held me close, his lips brushing my ear, and told me it was good luck. I believed him. I believed everything he said back then. When he asked me to move for him, I didn't hesitate. I packed up my life, left my career, and followed him to a city where I knew no one. He promised it would be temporary, that I'd find my own path once he got settled, but temporary stretched into years. My dreams, once sharp and vibrant, dulled with time, fading like old photographs left too long in the sun. I filled my days with mundane tasks, decorating our house, planning dinner parties, perfecting recipes. I played the role of the perfect wife, smiling at his colleagues, laughing at his jokes, turning a blind eye to the missed calls and late nights. He was building his empire, he told me. I had to be patient, but patience felt a lot like loneliness. I still remember the first time I noticed his phone habits change. He began keeping it face down, locked with a password I hadn't seen him use before. His smile grew tighter when I asked about his day, his replies clipped and evasive. I blamed work, I blamed stress, I blamed everything except what I feared most. My friends had questions too, gentle at first. Doesn't he travel a lot? You never seem to come out with us anymore. Are you happy, Liv? I brushed them off with practiced grace. Marcus is just busy. I'm happy, of course. I am, but their eyes would linger a little too long, concern flickering like candlelight before they moved on. I should have listened. I should have asked more questions. The whispers grew louder with time, but I refused to acknowledge them. I clung to the good memories, the mornings he'd bring me coffee in bed, the notes he'd leave in my purse, his cologne lingering on my skin after a tight embrace. Those memories were like pearls on a string, beautiful, but easily snapped. And yet, the signs were there, cracks in the glass fortress I had built around my heart. Lavish dinners for one, with empty chairs and untouched wine glasses. His suits, discarded carelessly over chairs, smelling of faint perfume that wasn't mine. I convinced myself it was all in my head, that I was paranoid, that love demanded trust, even when it was uncomfortable. But discomfort became loneliness, and loneliness became suspicion. I remember standing in our bedroom one night, holding a photograph from our wedding day. My dress sparkled with tiny beads that caught the light, my smile wide and genuine. Marcus's arms were wrapped around me, his eyes alight with joy, or at least I had thought so. I ran my fingers over the edges of the frame, rough and worn, from years of handling. It was the only photograph that wasn't digital. I had insisted on it, something tangible, something I could hold. Now, I held it like a lifeline, wondering when the smiles had stopped being real. I put the photograph back on the dresser and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked older, the light in my eyes dimmer than I remembered. I couldn't remember the last time Marcus had called me beautiful. I couldn't remember the last time he had called me anything other than Liv. And that night, for the first time, I allowed the seed of doubt to take root. I didn't sleep for days after that night in the ballroom. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire smile, bright and shining beside Marcus's, her hand casually draped over his shoulder as if she belonged there. The whispers I had overheard replayed in my mind, relentless, gnawing away at whatever remained of my trust. I waited for the perfect moment. When Marcus came home late one evening, the smell of whiskey clinging to his suit, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. I was in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea that had long since gone cold. "Long night?" I asked, my voice steady, though my hands were trembling just out of sight. He paused in the doorway, loosening his tie. "Yeah," Meeting ran late. You know how it is. I nodded slowly, watching his reflection in the window over the sink. His tie slipped off, landing on the counter with a careless flick of his wrist. He didn't meet my eyes. With Claire? The words hung in the air, sharp and metallic, slicing through the silence like a knife. Marcus stiffened, his hands freezing mid-motion. What are you talking about? I set the mug down carefully, the ceramic scraping against the countertop. Claire, your secretary, the one you've been screwing behind my back. His laugh was sharp and humorless. You're being ridiculous, Olivia. I'm being ridiculous? My voice cracked, but I pushed forward, my breath coming out, in uneven bursts. I know, Marcus. I know everything. The late nights, the trips, the text messages. I'm not blind. He rolled his eyes, leaning back against the counter with that infuriating smirk I once thought was charming. Now it just looked cruel. You're paranoid, he said coolly. You always have been. Maybe you should see someone about that. Fingers dug into the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. Don't do that, I whispered. Don't make this about me. You're imagining things. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper as if his lies would sound more convincing if they were hushed. You've always had a flair for the dramatic, Liv. Maybe it's time you grew up. The words struck like a slap, but I didn't flinch. I stared at him, long and hard, searching for some flicker of remorse. There was none, just cool indifference. The man I loved, the man I had built my life around, looked back at me with empty eyes. I let the silence stretch between us, thick and suffocating. And then I did what I never thought I would. I hired a private investigator. The evidence came in waves, unrelenting and undeniable. Photos of Marcus and Claire at a hotel downtown, their hands entwined as they walked through the lobby. I stared at the images until my eyes burned, memorizing the curve of her smile, the way she tilted her head when she looked at him. They looked happy, comfortable. There were pictures of them at dinners, tucked away in dark corners of candlelit restaurants. Her hand rested on his arm, his fingers brushing her cheek. There was nothing professional about it, not in the way they leaned into each other, whispering secrets that were never meant for me. But it was the hotel photos that broke me. I stared at the grainy image of Marcus holding the door open for her, his hand pressed against the small of her back as they disappeared into the elevator. My fingers curled around the edges of the photographs, crumpling them slightly. I imagined the sound of glass shattering, the feeling of something precious slipping through my fingers. When I finally looked away, my eyes landed on the silver frame on the mantel. Our wedding photo, pristine and perfect, my smile bright and unblemished by betrayal. I snatched it off the shelf, my fingers gripping the cool metal until it bit into my skin. For a long moment, I considered throwing it into the fireplace, watching it burn along with my illusions. But I didn't. I placed it back carefully, straightening the edges, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to break. 2 weeks later, I found myself at the annual charity gala, the one Marcus hosted every year. The room was filled with shimmering gowns and polished shoes, laughter bubbling up like champagne. I wore red, a bold, defiant red that clung to my skin and made me feel powerful. I walked through the room, my heels clicking against the marble, searching the crowd until I found her. Claire was standing by the bar, laughing with a group of his colleagues, a flute of champagne balanced gracefully in her hand. She looked beautiful, polished, perfect. But I saw her differently now. I saw her for what she really was. A thief. A woman who had stolen not just my husband but my trust, my sense of safety. I didn't pause to think. I walked up to her, my heart hammering in my chest, and I said her name. She turned, surprise flickering across her face before she plastered on a smile. Olivia, So good to see you. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice steady. I know. Her smile faltered, her eyes flickering with confusion. I'm sorry? I stepped closer, lowering my voice. I know about you and Marcus. I know everything. The color drained from her face, and for a moment, she stood frozen. And then she did what I didn't expect. She laughed. A soft, condescending chuckle that made my stomach turn. Oh, honey, she said, her voice dripping with pity. I thought you knew. The words burned, scorching a path through my chest. I stood there, frozen and humiliated, as the room seemed to close in around me. People were watching now, whispers spreading like wildfire. I saw Marcus across the room, his eyes wide with disbelief. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care about appearances. I walked out of that room with my head held high, but inside, I was crumbling. Marcus found me hours later at home, his eyes wild with anger. He called me insane, accused me of trying to destroy him. Friends stopped calling. I was the hysterical wife, the jealous one who couldn't keep her man. But in my solitude, something began to grow. A fire, slow and unyielding. Revenge curled its way around my heart, whispering promises of retribution. I wasn't going to be broken, not by him, not by her. And as I sat alone in the darkened living room, the firelight flickering across my hands, I imagined what it would be like to watch their world burn. When I told Marcus I needed space, he didn't even argue. He barely looked up from his phone, his fingers still tapping away at whatever was so important. I stood there, a suitcase by my side, waiting for him to say something. Anything. But all he offered was a distracted nod, his eyes never leaving the screen. So I left. I drove until the city lights faded behind me, the skyline shrinking in my rearview mirror, until it was nothing but a flicker of false promises. I found solace in a small town 2 hours away, a place with cobblestone streets and antique shops with chipped paint and hand-lettered signs. I rented a modest apartment with creaking floors and a view of the river, its waters calm and endless. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, a place where I could unravel without judgment. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift, if only slightly. I spent my mornings walking along the riverbank, the cold air biting at my cheeks. I reconnected with old friends over coffee and laughter that felt rusty but real. I found work with a startup company that didn't care about who my husband was, or the scandal I had left behind. They saw me, just me, and for the first time in a long while, that was enough. And that's when I met Daniel. It started innocently. Enough. I needed renovations done in the apartment. A new coat of paint, the floors refinished. A friend recommended him, a local contractor known for his attention to detail and fair prices. I called him up, and he arrived the next morning, right on time. He was tall, with tired eyes, and hands that looked like they'd seen more than their fair share of hard labor. He introduced himself with a firm handshake, his grip strong but gentle. I noticed the wedding ring on his finger, the subtle way he rubbed it when he talked about his work. He spent the next few weeks transforming my space, turning worn wood into polished elegance, breathing life back into walls that had been neglected. I'd bring him coffee in the mornings, and sometimes we'd chat while he worked. It was small talk at first. Weather, the price of materials, the unpredictable nature of construction. But over time, the conversations grew deeper. I learned about his wife, Claire, and how they'd been struggling for years. How she always seemed to need more money, more attention, more of everything he couldn't provide. I bit my tongue the first time he mentioned her name. I bit it again the second time. But eventually, the truth spilled out. It was an accident, really. We were painting the living room, his brushstrokes even and deliberate, when he asked if I was married. I paused, the roller heavy in my hand. Not for long, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from his work, his gaze steady. I'm sorry to hear that. I stared at him for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, before I could stop myself, I said, Claire's the reason why. The brush slipped from his hand, landing with a splatter of paint on the tarp-covered floor. His eyes locked on mine, wide and unblinking. What did you say? I took a deep breath, setting my roller down. Claire, your wife. She's been having an affair with my husband. Silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. His hands clenched at his sides, the muscles in his jaw tightening. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I could feel the weight of his disbelief, the sting of betrayal mirrored in his eyes. Finally, he whispered, I knew something was wrong. I didn't want to believe it. I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. I knew the burn of betrayal too well. From that moment on, things changed. Daniel showed up earlier, stayed later. He worked with a fire I hadn't seen before, a determination that came from something deeper than a simple renovation. I watched him closely, noticing the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands sometimes shook when he thought I wasn't looking. Claire had drained him dry, emotionally, financially, spiritually. And as the weeks went on, I began to see him not just as a contractor, but as an ally, a partner in pain. One evening, after he finished sanding the hardwood floors in the living room, I asked him to stay for a drink. We sat in silence for a while, the whiskey burning warm and bitter as it slipped down our throats. He looked at me then, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite place. What are you going to do? He asked finally, his voice rough around the edges. I swirled the amber liquid in my glass, watching it catch the light. I'm going to rebuild, I said softly. I'm going to make them pay. His eyes met mine, steady and unflinching. I want in. I set my glass down, the decision already made. I'm planning renovations on my office. I could use someone with your skills. His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. I'll be there. And just like that, the foundation of my fortress was laid. There's a certain satisfaction that comes with knowing your enemy's moves before they even make them. It's like watching a chessboard, each piece placed with deliberate care, anticipating every counter-move. And in this game, Marcus was blissfully unaware that I was the one orchestrating every step. It started with a whisper, just a subtle nudge in the right direction. My newfound connections, born out of my quiet rebuilding, whispered in Marcus's ear about a contractor with exceptional skills. Someone who could transform spaces with remarkable efficiency and discretion. His name, of course, was Daniel. Marcus, ever the businessman, couldn't resist the allure of a good deal. He brought Daniel into his circle without a second thought, never once connecting him to me. The beauty of it was almost poetic. Daniel walked through the doors of Marcus's company with a set of blueprints under his arm, and a mask of indifference so convincing even I found myself impressed. We played our parts with flawless precision. Daniel and I became quiet allies, exchanging knowing glances during business meetings and corporate events. I'd see him standing in the corner, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze sweeping the room with a calmness that belied the storm brewing beneath his surface. And I would smile, a small, private smile that he always returned with a subtle nod. I coached him carefully, feeding him secrets I'd uncovered about Marcus and Claire. Small, almost imperceptible lies Marcus told, discrepancies in his finances, whispers of backdoor deals that left Claire giggling behind her manicured hand. Daniel listened, his eyes hardening with each revelation. It wasn't long before Marcus began to trust him. Daniel's work was exceptional, every project finished under budget, every detail meticulously handled. Marcus sang his praises to anyone who would listen, and I watched from the sidelines, my heart pounding with anticipation. Meanwhile, I rose from the ashes of my old life like a phoenix reborn. I built a consulting firm from the ground up, using the skills I had once sacrificed for Marcus's ambition. It wasn't easy. I pulled long hours, made countless calls, forged alliances that Marcus had once told me were impossible. But I did. My social circles expanded. Invitations poured in, and I walked into rooms that Marcus once dominated with my chin held high. The first time I saw him at an event, he barely recognized me. I was draped in emerald silk, my hair swept back, lips painted a deep crimson. His gaze lingered a little too long, his smile a little too strained. I saw Claire on his arm, her eyes darting between us, and I raised my glass in a silent toast, watching Marcus's jaw clench from across the room. Daniel, for his part, thrived. His work with my firm gave him financial stability, a way out of the pit Claire had dug for him. He grew more assertive, more confident. I saw the lines of strain fade from his face, replaced by determination. His hands no longer shook when he picked up a hammer, and he no longer looked away when someone mentioned her name. We moved our pieces carefully, deliberately. I planted seeds of distrust where it would hurt the most. Marcus began questioning Claire's spending, her late nights, her mysterious appointments that didn't quite line up with her calendar. I watched their arguments escalate from across the ballroom, her face flushed with indignation, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Daniel and I exchanged a glance from opposite sides of the room. He nodded once, and I knew the time was close. The final move came in the form of a package. Daniel slipped it onto my desk one morning, his expression blank, his eyes sharp. I opened it carefully, peeling back layers of tissue paper to reveal glossy photographs, their edges crisp and clean. The images were sharper than I expected. Claire and Marcus, caught in the act during work hours, her perched on his desk, his hand tangled in her hair, the office door carelessly cracked open. There were more: dinners, hotel rooms, stolen kisses that looked more desperate than romantic. I spread them out across my desk, running my fingers over the images. My office window stretched behind me, the city skyline glimmering with the promise of retribution. I saw my reflection in the glass, my hair swept back, my eyes sharp and unyielding. For a moment I didn't recognize myself. I looked like a queen. Daniel leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed, his gaze steady. "What's the next move?" he asked quietly. I turned back to the photos, my lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile. "We make sure the world knows exactly who they are." He nodded, pushing off the doorframe and straightening his jacket. "I'm in." There was a time when I would have hesitated, when I would have worried about the consequences, about appearances. But that time had long since passed. I looked at the ring still glittering on my finger, a symbol of promises broken, of lies whispered in the dark. It felt heavy, a shackle disguised as a token of love. With a steady hand, I slid it off, setting it down on the desk beside the photographs. It glimmered in the light, catching the reflection of the city beyond my window. I stared at it for a moment longer, then turned my back on it, stepping away with purpose. We had set the chessboard. The pieces were in motion. And the next move would be mine. The morning of the shareholder meeting dawned clear and sharp, the kind of autumn day that felt crisp with promise. I dressed carefully, slipping into a black silk dress that hugged my frame with elegant precision. My hair was pinned back, not a strand out of place, and I wore a pair of diamond earrings Marcus had given me on our 10th anniversary. They glimmered, with icy clarity, a stark reminder of broken vows. The ballroom was lavish, dripping with opulence as shareholders filtered in, greeting each other with handshakes and polite nods. Marcus stood near the stage, his suit tailored to perfection, his smile practiced and hollow. I watched him from the back of the room. Daniel by my side, his expression calm and resolute. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, his hands steady. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low. I looked at Marcus, watched him laugh with a colleague, his eyes glancing at the clock. He had no idea. He still believed he was untouchable. "I'm ready." The meeting began with a flourish of applause, Marcus taking the stage with the confidence of a man who had never known failure. He spoke of growth, of prosperity, of vision, words that flowed smoothly off his tongue, practiced and polished. I felt my stomach turn, but I kept my face serene, my hands clasped in my lap. When the lights dimmed for the presentation, I straightened, my breath steady. Daniel gave me a nod, his fingers tapping a series of keys on his phone, sending the signal. I held my breath as the screen flickered, the company logo replaced with a slideshow of numbers and charts. Marcus continued talking, his voice filling the room with hollow promises, and then the screen flickered again. At first it was subtle, a flash of an image, gone in a blink. Marcus paused, glancing back at the screen with confusion. He laughed it off, a nervous chuckle that echoed across the room. "Looks like we're having a little technical glitch. Let's move on." Another flicker. Longer this time. Claire's face, her hand resting on Marcus's chest in a darkened restaurant, her eyes shining with something more than professionalism. Gasps rippled through the room, whispers spreading like wildfire. Marcus turned back to the screen, his face draining of color. "Stop the feed," he shouted, his voice cracking. But it was too late. The images kept coming, slow and deliberate. Hotel rooms, candlelit dinners, stolen kisses in the back of his office, his hand on her thigh, her lips on his neck. The room erupted, voices overlapping in disbelief and outrage. Claire, seated near the front, went rigid, her face paling to a sickly white. She bolted for the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors as she disappeared through the doors. Marcus stood frozen, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. His eyes searched the room, wild and desperate, until they landed on me. For a moment, time froze. He took a step forward, his mouth opening to speak, but I raised my hand, silencing him. I rose from my chair, smoothing out my dress, and walked to the front of the room. My heels clicked with steady confidence, each step a drumbeat of resolution. The whispers fell silent, all eyes turning toward me. I took the microphone from its stand, the cool metal familiar beneath my fingertips. I looked out over the crowd, my gaze sweeping across the faces. Some shocked, some smug, some whispering behind manicured hands. I took a deep breath and spoke. "Loyalty," I began, my voice carrying through the silence. "Integrity. Trust." I let the words linger, watching as the weight of them settled. These are the values we were promised. These are the values we built our lives upon. My eyes found Marcus, still frozen by the stage, his mouth slightly open, his hands balled into fists. "And yet," I continued, my voice sharper now, "some of us have forgotten those promises." A murmur spread through the crowd, heads nodding, whispers growing louder. I straightened my shoulders. I once believed in this company. I once believed in the man who built it. I paused, letting the silence stretch. But now I see that loyalty was never returned. That integrity was nothing more than a polished lie. The shareholders turned their gaze to Marcus, whose face was a mask of disbelief and rage. This is a setup," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She's lying. This is—" "Enough," I interrupted, my voice ringing with finality. "The evidence is there. You can try to spin it, but the truth is clear." Marcus's shoulders slumped, his fists dropping to his sides. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. The room erupted in chaos, board members demanding answers, shareholders shouting for his resignation. I watched it unfold with a calmness that surprised even me. Daniel stepped forward, his presence solid and unwavering, his eyes fixed on Marcus with something between pity and disdain. The board made their decision within the hour. Marcus was stripped of his title, his shares frozen pending investigation. Claire was terminated, her reputation shattered. I heard whispers of Daniel filing for divorce, whispers that grew louder as the news spread. When it was all over, I walked out of the boardroom with Daniel beside me. The autumn air was crisp, the sky clear and bright. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of it settling over us. "You did it," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "No," I replied, turning to face him. "We did it." He smiled then, genuine and unguarded. I hadn't seen him smile like that before. "What now?" he asked. I looked out over the city, the buildings glimmering in the morning light. "Now?" I said, my voice strong. "Now I rebuild." We parted ways on the corner, his hand warm as he squeezed mine. I watched him walk away, his shoulders straighter, his step lighter. I knew I would see him again, but for now, I needed to close the chapter properly. I returned to my office, the one Daniel had renovated, the one that now felt like mine and mine alone. The windows stretched across the far wall, casting sunlight over the polished oak desk. A vase of lilies sat in the center, their petals pale and perfect, a symbol of rebirth. I placed my hands on the desk, breathing in the scent of fresh flowers and freedom. The wedding ring I had worn for so many years was gone, replaced by a delicate silver bracelet that glimmered in the light. It was simple, elegant, a reminder of strength, of survival. I watched the city through the glass, my reflection superimposed over the skyline, strong and unyielding. My eyes caught on a photo frame tucked in the corner of my desk, an image of me, alone, smiling in front of the riverbank where I had started my journey. I reached out, touching the frame with gentle fingers. It felt real, solid, mine. And as I stood there, sunlight washing over me, I realized I had done more than survive. I had conquered.